We're in a journey in the life of David these days, and we're calling it pursuit. In other words, how to cultivate a heart that's in pursuit of God. What does that look like? And you know that David wrote Psalms at poignant, significant, broken, and triumphant moments in his journey. And this weekend's teaching, we're going to begin with the Psalm and end with the Psalm. And I'm going to start at Psalm 142. So please feel free to join me. By the way, we have Bibles in English and Spanish in the back of the room. You can also, with notes, we have hard copy notes, or if it's more accessible for you to use YouVersion, you can do it digitally, okay? I do want to extend a warm welcome to our online audience. So glad to have you with us this weekend. So Psalm 142, you'll notice what it says. A psalm of David when he was in the cave, a prayer. Listen. I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out my complaint before him. Before him, I tell my trouble. Does that sound like anything you've ever needed to say to God before? When my spirit grows faint within me, it's you who know my way. In the path where I walk, men have hidden a snare for me. Look to my right and see, no one's concerned for me. I have no refuge. No one cares for my life. So I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you alone are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I am in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison, that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. If you say, John, that sounds like a broken man, you would be absolutely right. Because from the time that David was anointed by Samuel to be the next king of Israel, to the time that he actually began to reign on the throne of the nation was over a decade, probably about 13 years. And you say, well, John, what happened in that 13-year interval? A whole bunch of brokenness. Which brings us to the focus for our Bible study this weekend, how to learn to play hurt. Playing hurt is critical to growing in our faith. So let me put it this way. Playing hurt is no big deal in the NFL, is it? Any NFL fans here? On any given week, those of you that are really focused or you're into fantasy football or whatever, you're watching even the injury charts. And is my guy going to play this weekend or not be able to play this weekend? Because what NFL guys know when they sign on the dotted line, they know that every time they're injured and they come out of a game with a limp, that they're going to have intense therapy, there will be rub downs, there will be rehab, there will be state-of-the-art medical procedure applied to their owie boo-boo because they've got to get back on the field. Why? Baby, it is game time. That's why. Now, not being a doctor, I didn't realize how things could be as significant as a left big toe, but one of my favorite linebackers is not playing today or even for the rest of the year because Patrick Willis has an injured left big toe. I mean, you got 9 others, dude. Get out on the field. But I guess a left big toe is a big deal. Shows you what I know. All I can say is from the 49ers organization and their economic model, that is a very expensive left big toe, if you know what I mean. Now, moving from the mundane like the NFL to a spiritual context, it's been my observation over the years in my own life and being able to care for people as a pastor, shepherd, servant leader in the local church that millions of believers are permanently sidelined. You say, John, you don't mean millions. Yes, I do mean millions. That millions of believers are permanently sidelined, and here's why. Because they get hurt, they feel deeply wounded, and they simply quit. In other words, they've not learned the spiritual art of playing hurt, which is what we are going to download from David's life this weekend. What it means to play hurt. That we cannot quit every time that we are wounded. In other words, we must learn to play hurt. And in fact, it's in playing hurt that is probably the most teachable moment of our whole spiritual journey. I want to say that again. It is probably the most spiritually fruitful window of time in our whole spiritual formation when we learn to play hurt. And you'll understand why by the time we're done with this Bible study this morning. Now, if I were to give you a topography or even a geography of the physical environs of where David most learned to play hurt, you ready for this? It would be caves. David learned to know God in a cave. Now, don't get stuck on the idea of caves because we are a 21st century American audience in the Bay Area. And you say, dude, I've never even been in a cave. I mean, for most of us, we bumped into caves, in our maybe grammar school years when we were required to read the or rather the Mark Twain classic, where Tom and Becky, Tom Sawyer, and they got lost in the cave and that whole deal. And so you might remember spelunking in your early encounters with caves. This is not that kind of a cave. This is not a romance novel. This is not a classic novel. This is about growing up in God and how to play hurt. So one person puts it this way about caves. Caves are not the ideal place for morale building. There's a certain sameness to them all, no matter how many caves you have been in. They are all dark, wet, cold, stale, and you are alone. And a cave becomes even worse when you're the sole inhabitant. When David was in the cave, his ambition now reached no higher than a shepherd's staff. Everything was being crushed out of him. And in those caves of sorrow, David became simply the greatest comforter of broken hearts the world has ever known. Some of you need to know that one of the best things that God's going to do out of your private pain, if you will stay the course, if you and I will learn to play hurt, is that we're going to become, at the end of the day, wounded healers. Do you know what I mean by wounded healers? People like all the race of men that at some point were wounded, but we fought through our woundedness with God's help. And on the other end, though we had a jagged scar, which we now prefer to refer to as a beauty mark, we still remember the pain. But who could be more ready to care for others in their pain than somebody's come through deep pain and triumphed? So that's what I mean when I say that we become wounded healers. And I think in the best sense of the word, in some way, you and I are all becoming that, aren't we? Now, being who we are in the 21st century, the idea of an ancient biblical cave in the ancient Near East is kind of an abstract concept. So I want to take you on a little 3-minute video journey. Actually, these are my sons. You're only going to see one of them. Carrie and I have 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. We reared our children with the idea of suck the marrow out of life. Go for the gold. Dream big. Shoot for the moon. If you miss, at least you get over the fence, Just absolutely go for it. We didn't think they were listening, but they were. And so Logan joined Ryan. Ryan lived in Israel for 3 years. Logan joined him there, and they got this idea, hey, let's hike around the whole perimeter of the nation of Israel. Apparently, there's a trail there, and before you think that's an epic conquest, Israel's a very small nation, okay? So it can be done by a couple hardy people in a relatively short amount of time. At any rate, they were about halfway through, and they wound up at the Dead Sea, which is about an hour outside of Jerusalem, and they said, let's go find the Dead Sea Caves. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with archaeology, there is no moment in archaeology that more proved the accuracy of the Bible through the ages than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, I don't have time to go into it right now. Google it, you'll read about it and find out what I'm talking about. So my sons persistently tried to find these caves, and they found them. And they ended up in cave number 1, and that's where we're going to go via video journey. I don't exactly know how the Israeli Department of Archaeology feels about this and the initiative my sons took. So, yeah, just watch. This is what caves like David experienced in learning to play hurt are really like.
We're here just north of Qumran, a ways. The Dead Sea is this way. And we're up in the limestone cliffs, and after a lot of searching and some frustration, we've come to Cave 1, which is this right here. And I just wanted to make a small video so we could get a 3D effect because the pictures don't quite do that. So it was this top hole that a shepherd threw a stone in 47, I think, And he was a Bedouin after a stray, and apparently he threw it in and heard some crashing inside. The next day, he and a buddy crawled in, and they found 8 jars on the floor, intact, 7 of which were empty, but one of which had 3 large leather scrolls in it. And it's a long story, you can look it all up, but that's how it began. And then these 2 smaller holes, I believe, at least this one, I'm not sure of this one, but I think both of them were later made artificially by the excavators for ease of entrance. And this is called Cave 1. And there's 11 caves that the Dead Sea Scrolls have been found in, but this is the one that sparked the discovery, that created the awareness that the community at Qumran, who were probably associated with the Essene sect, that they had basically stored their whole library in these caves, leading up to in response to the Roman invasion in 68, the Jewish revolt. And they never came back to claim their scrolls. And 1900 years, these scrolls sat here untouched, except by a little bit of dampness and a little bit of droppings from the bats. And so we'll just come inside real quick to get a 3D feel. It's really not a big cave. A lot of the caves around here are expansive. I mean, they go back and there's rooms and this is a pretty small cave. And when we came in first, just a little bit ago, some bats were flying around in here, and we were reading the reports that there were about 50 centimeters of just kind of powdery dust and loose shale before the hard ground was found. And it was here. It's not. I'll just walk to the back of the cave so you can see and get a feeling for depth. But I'm now in the back of the cave. It just kind of ends in this crevice back here. And so it's beautiful to think that this room housed the beauties of Isaiah and an early apocalypse, the sons of light, the war of the sons of light, and a commentary on Habakkuk. Actually, two different versions of Isaiah. And right here in this room for all those years, and we sang worship songs, and we read from the Hebrew text of our favorite passages of Isaiah. And maybe you could turn around, Logan, and show the view looking outward, what it looks like. Yeah. So that's it. This is Cave 1. I hope to maybe return here sometime to worship and to meditate. It's a little hard to find, but that's it.
So it was a cave like that in which David hid on and off for over a decade, when God was crushing David, when God was making David, while David was with terror fleeing for his life from a jealousy-crazed king. And all of that happened before David ever sat one day on the throne of the nation. Gene Edwards puts it this way. He says that God has a university, and God's university is a very small school, and few enroll, even fewer graduate, very, very, very few indeed. God has this school because he does not have broken men and women. Instead, he has several other types of men and women. He has men and women who claim to be God's authority and aren't, men and women who claim to be broken and aren't, men and women who are God's authority but who are mad and unbroken. And he has, regretfully, a mixture of everything in between. All of these he has in abundance, but broken men and women God hardly has at all. Now, in God's sacred school of submission, Gene Edwards continues, in his sacred school of brokenness, why are there so few students? Answer, because all who are in this school must suffer much pain. And as you might guess, it's often the unbroken ruler who God has sovereignly picked who meets out that pain. And so David was once upon a time a student in God's school, hiding in a cave, and Saul was God's chosen way to crush David. And as the king grew in madness, David grew in understanding. He knew that God had placed him in the king's palace under true authority. And David drew in his breath. He placed himself under his mad king, and he moved farther down the path of his earthly hell. Unquote. I want you to make note of this. God uses broken people. Now, you may still be struggling a bit with the notion of broken. We're gonna unpack that yet a little bit more, especially if you're new to God or the Bible. You're saying, man, I'm feeling like there's an incongruity here. I thought he was a good God, a loving God. This doesn't feel like either of those qualities. We're going to discover that God used David because David became a broken man through caves. He learned to play hurt. Now, remember also what David was. David was talented and gifted. Absolutely no doubt about that. In spades, David had natural skills. I mean, he was dealt a good hand in life, but that is not why God chose David. There are no end of uber-talented men and women whom God passes by because they don't have a heart that matches the God call that God's entrusted to them. David, you may remember also, was handsome and charismatic. If you want to struggle with temptation on a regular basis, then just be handsome or beautiful and charismatic, and you will constantly, daily have temptation knocking at your door. David was both of those things, but that's not why God chose him. David was a man of humility. David was a man who had a heart after God, forged in the furnace of suffering, of pain, of injustice, of caves. And that is why God used David. Please never forget this. If we move David from the great Goliath moment and now he's on the throne moment, and we forget the 10 to 13 years in between, we completely misunderstand the David narrative. We have done violence and injustice to Holy Scripture, but because we forgot about all the in-between time, and it was that in-between time where God was making David a man after his own heart. Without the in-between time, we would not be studying the life of David today, I promise you. You say, John, talk to me about brokenness a little bit more, okay? Let me give you some synonyms. It means to be pliable. It means to be, in the best sense of the word, shattered and crushed. It means to submit. Do you know what a beautiful word submission is? Because it means to respond to the leadership of. And once we sign on the dotted line and we've surrendered our life to Christ, now comes a lifetime of learning how to submit at ever greater levels to his lordship and his legitimate rulership in our life. Submission is beautiful. Brokenness means surrendered. It means humility. It means meekness. Brokenness is being hurt in a good way, and I mean by that, from a spiritual perspective, being hurt in a good way. It's the unanticipated blows, the injustice, the disappointments, the pain, all the normal stuff of life in the will of God that the sovereign God allows to come our way to crush us, to break us, and to make us. You say, John, is there going to be a happy part to this message at some point? Probably not this weekend, guys. But if we can move past the silly, frothy American notion of happiness, and we can begin to understand the deeply embedded reality of joy, I hope that there's an emerging joy, as we understand there is a reason for what you and I are going through right now, and that God neither sleeps nor slumbers, that God works graveyard 24/7 and swing shift end days, and he has not forgotten there's a point to my pain. If we can approach it that way, then yeah, there's going to be some happiness in the house before we leave today. Now, we learn to deal with pain. And do you know what I think the Bible would imply to us about pain? Pain is the gift that nobody wants. I mean, we're pretty cool with other people's pain. God, I love what you're doing in their life through the pain and suffering they're going through. Look what a beautiful person they're becoming. But do we want that same gift from God? No way. Absolutely not. So let me put it to you this way. You could say that in our pleasures, God whispers. In pain, God shouts. Whatever you packed in the house with you this weekend, pain, injustice, suffering, the caves of life, begin to see that the sovereign, loving, holy, good God has purpose for your pain, that he has not forgotten thee, and that he is doing in you what once upon a time he did in our man David. Now let me take it a step further. I believe this. I haven't fully understood its implications. I'm working out its implications in my own life. But this, I believe, the Bible also teaches, that God cannot use a person greatly that he hasn't hurt deeply. Show me a person in the Bible, man or woman, that God used greatly that didn't have terrible seasons of pain in their life. Because God can't use what he hasn't broken. He has to tear down the old before he can build the new in him. Okay, let's hop from Old Testament to New. You remember Paul? God used him to write half the New Testament. When we're introduced to Paul, he is a smug, arrogant, violent, learned religious leader called a Pharisee. He is the man. And if you ever doubt that, just ask him. He'll tell you. He was Saul of Tarsus initially, and he was tutored personally under Gamaliel, who was a legendary first century academic. I mean, Paul had all the material goods of this world. And Paul began to come to the end of Paul. The crushing, the breaking of God began in his life one day on a road to Damascus, Syria, to kill more followers of the way. So this same Paul, if we translate a decade forward, this is what that Paul would write. He would say in one of his letters to the churches, nevertheless, not I live, but Christ lives in me. All the old Paul had to be crushed out of him, and that Paul had to be emptied so there was space for Jesus now to fit in. You say, how cool is that? Okay, yeah, but you may not be in touch with Paul's life enough to know that you know how his mentoring began? His discipleship began right after the road to Damascus. He went to the desert of Arabia for 3 years and was alone with God. Caves, again. Because it's in the crushing of aloneness and of solitude and of searching for God and a soul that is desperate, yearning for the infinite, eternal Holy One. And that's what happened to Paul. The only thing that kept David from becoming Saul II was God's chosen instruments to crush David. And in the day, do you know what God's chosen instruments to crush David were? Make note of it. Saul, a mad, crazed, jealous king. And even worse still, I mean, the knife is in and now we're twisting it. His own son, Absalom, his own flesh and blood. Absalom was a handsome, gifted, charismatic young man, like you know who. But he was an angry, hostile, bitter young man. And it cost him his life. Now think about it. Would you be confused? Would I be confused if the very individual that gave us our start in life and ministry, that was our tutor, our mentor, our guide, like a spiritual father to us. I'm talking about what Saul the king was to the young David. And now this very same person turns violently against us. Jealousy crazed, hurling spears at us, seeking to literally murder us. How confusing is that? How much would that make us come undone at the seams? How many caves would we need to live in, hiding for our life, sobbing at the top of our lungs? That was the saga of David. Now, when we think about the implications of playing hurt. Understand that for David, what it meant was over a decade of cave dwelling, where there were tears and fears, and tears and fears, and oft thrown spears right in David's direction. David lived with a crosshair on him. He lived in constant, overwhelming fear. He was running through desert terrain, immense political intrigue, endless sobbing, hysteria, anguish, brokenness, and then finally, this man David that we study, that was nurtured in solitude, strengthened in conflict, matured in hopelessness, God says, David, now you're ready to be my king. And so God allowed another battle between the Philistines and Israel. And there was a mount called Gilboa. And on the mount, the king of Israel died. Saul was dead. And tragically, so was David's best friend, Jonathan. Samuel was by this time also dead. So the three men that were the shapers and the guardians of David's soul are now gone. Samuel and Saul and Jonathan, and David is all alone. But the David we see approaching the age of 30 and the David to which we were introduced at 15, 16 years old, they ain't even close to the same David. You know, the skin's the largest organ on the body, and you know that about every 7 years we are, in some sense, new people, almost a sort of anatomical metamorphosis, so to speak. And so it is spiritually if we're becoming. We should not be the same person a decade hence that we are right now in the day. If that happens, something's not right within us spiritually, because it is not normal to not grow. In fact, I could argue biblically, it is abnormal. And so please don't put David on the throne right away. Remember God's timetable of suffering. You say, okay, yeah, but David's just one example. No, David's not just one example. You remember the dude that started it all, Father Abraham? He waited over 4 decades for the promise of God to materialize in his life, that he'd be the father of a great nation. How about our man Moses? He also waited 40 years. And Moses, who grew up as a son of Pharaoh in the court of mighty Egypt, Moses now spends 4 decades shepherding sheep in the backside of the desert. God needed to crush all the court life of Egypt out of Moses, all the pretense, all the arrogance, all the pretensions to power. Kill all of it, or Moses will never be ready to do what I have called him to do. Joseph, arguably the most sinless God-called individual in the Bible, still he ends, or rather begins his formation period at age 17. I mean, it's just like Pete and repeat, Groundhog Day here. Because of jealous brothers, this time 11 of him, boom, tossing him down in a pit. And it was injustice after injustice. He ends up in prison, etc., etc. Do you see what I'm suggesting here, friends? This is not the exception. This is the biblical norm. The pain that you endured today when you came to church, the suffering, the injustice, it is not the exception. It is the norm if, in fact, we want to grow spiritually. And that's why learning the spiritual art of playing hurt is absolutely critical, so that we don't bench ourselves in growing up in God. So we don't become just another statistic and another casualty and another spiritual lightweight that couldn't hack it. I've prayed so often in my own flawed journey, God, give me a position beyond my character. Asking God to give me a character commensurate to the call that he has in my life. I hope you'll pray the same way. If you're a little more simple person like I am, maybe this prayer fits you better. God, please make me the person that my dog thinks I am. How many of you love the loyalty of dogs? Now, if you're like digging cats, I'm just so sorry. I don't know what to do with the cat. They're just like a Philistine. I don't know. They're just, okay. Dogs are loyal. I mean, you kick a dog, what do? They come back, their tongues wagging, they're slobbering all over the place. You know, they're happy ending, their tails just going like this. They want to make up like, I did something to offend you, Master, please, I worship you, hallelujah. God, please make me the person my dog thinks that I am. See, we're talking about the transformation of internal character formation. Alan Redpath, a fellow pastor, put it this way. He said, the conversion of a soul is the miracle of a moment. The manufacture of a saint is the task of a lifetime. We ain't going to be done till the end of the day. We cannot win this faith journey if we throw in the white towel halfway, 3/4 of the way, even 99% of the way. We've got to wait for our heavenly promotion day when we stand before Him on that day. And we've got to stay the course. We've got to learn to play hurt. David is showing us the way. Do you know the name, those of you that were alive and maybe adults in the 70s? Do you remember the whole Watergate scandal? And you remember in the Watergate scandal, one of the indicted and found guilty and in prison individuals was Charles Colson, who was brilliant and ruthless. You ever notice how those two things go together, brilliant and ruthless? Do you know what the real issue going on in that soul is? Intense pride. So Chuck Colson was busted along with Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Nixon and so the whole deal. And it was going to prison that saved Chuck Colson's life, because in prison, Chuck Colson, at the end of Chuck Colson, found God. And he spent the rest of his life not in the corridor of pretensions to power. He spent the rest of his days serving prisoners around the world, writing books. Chuck died a year, 2 years ago or so. Where Chuck is today is because of prison. Meeting God in prison assured Chuck Colson heaven when he left the earth. And he has, and he is. It wasn't all a primrose path, however, for Chuck after he came to faith in God, and he calls one particularly difficult moment his soul's dark night. These are his own words. And he's talking about a very tightly compressed 2-3 month period in his life. And he says, in that period of time, my son Wendell was diagnosed with bone cancer. My daughter Emily was diagnosed with skin cancer. My wife underwent major surgery. And I had a horribly ugly situation with a disgruntled former employee. And in that time, I found myself wrestling with the Prince of Darkness, who attacks us when we are weakest. I walked around night after night after night, asking God why He would allow this, alone, shaken, fearful. And in despair, at the end of myself, I came to the rational explanation. When there is no rational explanation for reality, I came to the understanding that God cannot not be. It struck me, I don't have to make sense of the agonies I bear or hear a clear answer. God's not a creature of my emotions. God's not a creature of my senses. God is God. The one who created me takes responsibility for His children's destiny. I can only cling to the certainty that He is, that He has spoken, and that He is good. And then Charles references another Charles Spurgeon, when he says, when God hides His face from you, don't say that He has forgotten me. He is only waiting a little while to make you love Him better. And then Charles Colson concludes with these words: faith becomes strongest when we are without consolation and must walk in the darkness in complete abandon toward Him. We glean from the Bible that the love of God is unconditional. Probably most of us would yield the point in the house and say, yeah, that is so. But the trust of God is conditional. How do we become trustworthy persons of character to whom God can trust a mantle of influence for His causes and His purposes in this life? Here's the answer to that vexing question. He will forge that trustworthy character in the furnace of suffering and pain. just like he did David, and just like he did all the other women and men in the Bible. God used a mad king and a rebellious son to prepare David. What is he using for you these days? Is it your marriage partner, your mate? Remember, what began for you once upon a time as an ideal arrangement, soon thereafter, because marriage at its essence is two imperfect persons dwelling together forever. It began as an ideal and it soon became an ordeal. And now, after these years and the accumulated pain of that somewhat dysfunctional relationship, you feel like you got a raw deal and now you want a new deal. I would urge you not to run out the house and go get a new deal, because you're just packing your unresolved issues with you, and you will export those into the new relationship and poison that new relationship until we deal with ultimate issues in our lives. You say, John, what happened when it was all moonlight and roses and now it's dishes and diapers and agony? I'll tell you what happened. Life happened. Imperfection happened. We don't like the idea of we like all the wonder and mystery and sensuality and newness and adrenaline rush of new marriage. But what we don't like is that the Bible teaches that marriage at its core is a refining process. It's almost as though the husband and the wife are two pieces of sandpaper that rub up against one another. And if we'll stay the course, eventually we'll smoothen each other out. But if we bolt, we will remain unfinished. Now, this is not at all meant to in any way impose guilt on those of you that may have had great pain, even a failure in a past marriage relationship. Not at all. I myself grew up in a blended family. My parents married young, divorced young. So that's not the point at all. I'm simply saying, even in the best case, marriage is a challenge, but stay the course. Maybe for you, it's not marriage, it's child raising. Carrie and I were blessed by God to have 4 children. I got to tell you, being married's a piece of cake compared to raising kids. Because at least with marriage, you're living with another adult, or at least in theory. With children, you are starting from scratch with a newborn. Mark Twain said, I have an answer for that. When the kid turns 13, put him in a barrel and feed him through a knothole. And then when the kid turns 16, just plug up the knothole. I'm pretty sure that both state and federal law disallows that. Please don't do that. That was a metaphor for teaching application purposes, not an actual suggestion for parenting, okay? Some of you, you deal with legitimate physical suffering in your health. And I know this because I know you, and the shepherd knows the flock. And I see some of you walking around, and you know what your constant companion is? Intense daily pain. You live with physical pain that would buckle the knees of most of us in the room every single day of your life. Where's God in that? Some of you have been absolutely, boom, punched in the kisser with a major vocational meltdown. Everything that you had worked towards, your academic preparation, your vocational preparation, was for that moment, and you thought it was going good, and then one day you went into work and found, in fact, there were others who thought quite the opposite. And now you find yourself having failed in your vocation, so to speak, with that boss from hell and that incredibly complex situation. You're saying, what now? Now, I could go on and on. I'm just sharing a few of the things that we try to help and encourage and walk through with you beautiful people, as I hear your stories and journey by your side in life. This is reality. These are the caves. We've got to learn to play hurt. Let me put it to you very simply. Please get this. If you've missed everything else, please remember this. God will pull us through if we can stand the pull. God will pull us through if we can stand the pull. Don't let go of the rope. You and I can't be in the 3rd grade forever, spiritually speaking. We got to go on to the 4th grade. We got to go on to the 5th grade. At some point, God help us, we got to go to middle school and high school and then get some undergraduate work done, and then at some point get a graduate degree. God will pull us through if we can stand the pull, because there's something better than first love. First love is euphoric. First love is adrenaline driven, whether it's marriage or God. Have you ever seen a newly born again person or somebody in their honeymoon? They're ridiculous. They're ridiculous. They're not even normal. I don't even talk to them. Just do your thing. I'll talk to you in 6 months. When you come back down to earth, because they levitate, just woo. What is better? Listen, you teach 4 times a weekend, you get a little delirious. I'm just telling you. What is more precious to the Father than first love is tried love. Love that's been tested. Love that's been proven over time. Love that's endured the ups and the downs and the caves and the injustice and the pain of it all. Whether it's our relationship with God or our relationship with people we love, tried love is what God values most. I'm going to wrap it up as I promised you I would with another David moment, yet another poem. Now, for those of you that have psychological pedigree, meaning maybe that's what you do, you are a PhD psychologist, psychiatrist, and so I will tell you that there are times that you would have to say David is a certifiable nutcase. Psalm 34 is one of them. I mean, David was so crazed with terror that he did the unthinkable. You know what he did? He ran to Israel's arch enemy, the Philistines, and sought asylum with them, with Abimelech the king. And they're thinking, this is the killer of Goliath. He wants to live with us now? This is not how. And so David feigned insanity. And I mean, it wasn't pretty. He's slobbering out, just all over himself, scratching and pawing the wall. And Abimelech says, are we so short of insane men? You had to go and get one from the people of Israel? I mean, that's the context. Unless we make it too pretty, that's really the context of what's going on. Now, listen to a heart after God right in the midst of the furnace of pain. Psalm 34, I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. My soul will boast in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Come, let us exalt his name together. Verse 4, it's your promise, everybody. I sought the Lord and he answered me and he delivered me from all of my fears. For those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. Notice, this poor man called and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and he delivers them. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and he delivers them. Verse 8, so taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man or woman who takes refuge in him. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. For the righteous cry out, verse 17, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all of their troubles. For the Lord, here's your promise verse for the week. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. A righteous man or woman may have many troubles, but the Lord will deliver them from all of them. And everybody said,